For my research study, I will be looking at a college student's workload, the amount of stress they face, and their overall well-being, and how they all correlate. So for the first article that relates to my study, it was done by Aidan Kosh in 2018. He wrote an honor thesis examining physiological and perceived stress levels in college students and how it all correlates with their academic workload and extracurricular involvement. His goal was to examine academic workload, extracurricular involvement, physiological stress, perceived stress, mental and physical health over a semester. The participants were 76 undergraduate students in intro psychology from Dayton University. He completed a longitudinal study with 2 parts. Part 1 was done during the first few weeks of a semester, and Part 2 was during the last few weeks of that same semester. During time 1, participants had their blood pressure and their heart rate taken, and a saliva sample was used to measure cortisol. They were then asked to complete a TSST, which was a test that assesses physiological reactivity to stress. During time 2, the same exact process was repeated, except they left out the test. Workload was measured by asking participants how difficult they perceived their major to be on a scale of 1 to 6, with 6 being the most difficult, along with the number of hours they spent doing schoolwork. Extracurricular involvement was measured by asking the number of hours they spent outside of school doing hobbies. Stress levels were measured using their cortisol levels, as mentioned before. Perceived stress was measured using the perceived stress scale. Their physical health was measured using the MOS 36-item health survey, and their mental health was measured using the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale, which was a scale that asked them how often they felt depressed during that week on a scale of 1 to 4, with 4 being extremely depressed. So during his phase 1, the first few weeks of the semester, he found that the more stressed a student was, the poorer their physical health. He also found that workload was not associated with their physical health, and neither was their perceived major difficulty. There was no correlation between perceived physical health and baseline physiological stress, perceived major difficulty, or their stress reactivity. The one with higher perceived stress during time 1 also had higher depression, but there was no association between depression and workload, or no significant association was found between depression and baseline physiological stress, or the perceived major difficulty, or stress reactivity. During time 2, Kosh found that there was no association between time 2 physical health and time 1 perceived stress or their perceived major difficulty. There was no association between time 2 physical health and time 1 baseline physiological stress or their perceived major difficulty. There was also no association between time 2 physical health and time 1 stress reactivity. But they did find that during time 2 depression and time 1 baseline physiological stress, those were associated, meaning students who had a higher time 1 baseline physiological stress were more depressed during time 2. They found, however, that depression was not associated with workload, but associated with perceived major difficulty. No association was found between time 2 depression and time 1 stress reactivity. Another article that related to my study was conducted by Shannon Ross, Bradley Nebling, and Teresa Heckert. They studied the major sources of stress among college students using the Student Stress Survey. This survey determined the major stressors that students felt during school. The scale included interpersonal, intrapersonal, academic, and environmental sources of stress. The top 5 stressors were change in sleeping habits, vacation and breaks, change in eating habits, increased workload, and new responsibilities. The study that they conducted consisted of 100 undergraduate students, which were 20 male and 80 female, from a Midwestern university. The survey used for this research consisted of 40 potential stressful situations, but was divided into 4 categories of potential sources of stress. 6 of these represented interpersonal, 16 represented intrapersonal, 8 of them represented academic, and 10 represented environmental. Each of the stressors were identified as daily hassles and major life events. The study's results showed that 89% of the stressors were change in sleeping habits, 82% were vacation and breaks, 74% was the change in their eating habits, 73% was newer responsibilities, and 73% again was increased class workload. Overall, 81% of the identified stress sources could be classified as daily hassles. In conclusion of the study, out of the top 5 stressors, 3 of those were interpersonal. The study suggested informing students about places on campus for help with their mental and physical health if needed, and that being stressed in college was completely normal. The top 5 coping responses were self-help, accommodation, approach, avoidance, and self-punishment. And the last article that I have in my introduction that relates to my study is a study done by Ruby Brogum, Christy Zale, Celeste Mendoza, and Janen Miller. The study was the major sources of stress and coping strategies among college students. Their study consisted of 166 college students from a liberal arts university in Southern California. 70 of these were men and 96 were women. The data was collected in the spring semester. The point of the study was to investigate the relationship between sex, specific stressors, and coping mechanisms. For the study, the participants completed a stress assessment inventory and a stress coping inventory based on a 5-factor revise of a COPE model that was previously made. They also completed a 37-item survey to identify 5 sources of stress. In order to get their results, they conducted a multivariate analysis of variance to examine whether men and women differed in overall stress levels. The results showed that significant sex differences in overall stress levels and in stress levels for specific stressors. An analysis of variance was done as a follow-up. These results also showed that college women reported greater stress levels for 4 stressors, but there was no significant sex differences found for academic stress. My hypothesis for my study was the amount of workload a college student receives significantly correlates to the amount of stress they face daily and their overall well-being. So my method, I did a correlational research method. My few variables were workload, stress, and well-being. And I had, my participants were going to be randomly selected from volunteers from the introductory psychology for their credits if they needed them. And it was going to be approximately 100 students. The workload will be measured using an 8-question self-report questionnaire. Stress will be measured using the perceived stress scale, and well-being will be measured using the well-being scale. My materials, as mentioned, are the perceived stress scale, well-being scale, and the demographic questionnaire. So in order to get my participants, the surveys will be uploaded through Sona Systems, and the participants are going to have to sign a consent form, and then they will be in there. So my results, there are 3 scores to be evaluated. I need the perceived stress scale score, the well-being score, and the demographic survey mean. I will conduct a 3 Pearson correlation coefficients for the 3 measures. The first measure will be the strength and direction of the relationship between workload and stress. The second measure will be the strength and direction and relationship between workload and overall well-being. The third measure will be the direction and relationship between stress and overall well-being. And the statistical significance of each Pearson R value is going to be evaluated with alpha set at 0.5. So I hypothesize that there's going to be a strong relationship between all 3 measures. There's going to be a strong relationship between the workload and the stress, workload and overall being, and stress and well-being as well. So a couple potential limitations could be a potential third variable. So students could have other reasons to be stressed more than just like having a certain amount of workload. There could be their outside life from school that has them stressed, and that could mess with the variables that I have now. And not caring for their well-being, not simply because they're stressed, but because they're depressed. They could be depressed for more reasons than just school. So there's many different reasons why that could be a limitation. And another one is self-reported data. Since my participants will be talking for themselves, some might want to put different answers just so they don't look like super depressed or so they look better than others, you know? So self-reported data would be a very hard limitation. My implications, workload is correlated with stress and well-being. Overall well-being is more taken care of when there are less things to worry about and they have less stressors. Future work, you can manipulate amount of workload and then measure their stress. So have a control group that has less work than one and another one that has a lot more than the other, and then compare their stress levels, probably using the same measures that Kosh did in his study. Take their cortisol levels and then see if that would affect any stress levels. And these are the references for the three articles I had in my thing. Thank you.